Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Navaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. I'm here with JP Errico. Nice to see you, JP.
Good to see you. Great to be here.
So today's topic is one that I feel is very important for people to understand because it really affects our daily life. It really affects why we want to do things, why we want to drive in a certain direction, or why we want to complete a certain task. And that is the topic of dopamine. So I'd love for us to talk a little bit first about what is dopamine? Why do we have it? What does it do for us?
Great questions. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It is produced in various different areas of the brain. And its primary function is to give us the motivation to do things, whether it be to think about something and concentrate on it, or to literally just get out of a chair and go get yourself a glass of water. It's, in my estimation, it's your motivation neurotransmitter. It gives you the reward relationship between the reward that you're going to get for doing something and the energy and the discipline to get up and do it.
Yeah, I call it kind of the get up and go, the motivation, the drive neurotransmitter, very similar concept to what you're sharing there. And it has to do with reward, but it's not necessarily produced in response to the reward. It's the drive towards accomplishing said goal. And I think that's a really important distinction to make right off the bat.
It's an incredibly important distinction because it leads to all the dysfunction that we see in society around loss of motivation, burnout, frustration at work, etc. Because you're right, dopamine is released in your brain when you anticipate that there's going to be a reward for doing something. So let's say you're presented with a group of different options of things to do. It could be just to stay sitting in a chair. It could be to get up and change the channel. It could be, although we do that with remotes now, get up and get yourself a drink of water or whatever. You have those options. You're aware of those options at all times. And at some point, the reward that you get for doing one of those things will reach a level to which you'll actually get up and you'll be motivated to do it. That process of weighing the reward, the future potential reward of your action against the energy expenditure necessary to do it is where dopamine comes in. And dopamine, if you have a low level of dopamine or less access to dopamine in your brain, you'll be less motivated. You'll be more sedentary. You won't get up and go. And so what we're hoping that we can do here is teach people how to conserve or preserve or enhance their dopamine levels and not lose their dopamine advantage, if you will, to things that really aren't helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, just like serotonin, acetylcholine, these neuromodulators, these chemicals that are sent between neuronal connections, but from one neuron to the next or to other tissues. And this neurotransmitter is actually produced from amino L-tyrosine, tyrosine being the amino acid precursor to dopamine, phenylalanine being on that pathway as well. So phenylalanine, tyrosine are amino acid precursors to the production of dopamine. I think it's an important thing to quickly understand that if we lack that particular amino acid in the first place, we lack the ability to produce enough dopamine as we go on a biochemical pathway. So this is an important thing for us all to understand from the nutrition standpoint, because often we're seeing people that are on diets that are quite low in a protein content, quite low on particular amino acids, tyrosine and phenylalanine being on this pathway, very important essential amino acids to get into the diet to help to actually have the building block that's required to produce or build dopamine within the body.
And I think that's a really important, I know it's a little off topic, but it's very important for people to recognize that there are a set number of amino acids that all of our proteins in our bodies are made from. So when we have a gene and it's transcribed into and translated into a protein through that elegant process that Mother Nature has developed, that requires that we have those amino acids available. And our bodies are capable of making a subset of those from, basic materials. But there are certain amino acids that human beings in our bodies are just not capable of making. So we have to acquire them through diet. And so having a decent amount of protein in your diet, even if you're on a so-called low protein diet, you have to make certain that you're getting those essential amino acids into your system. And yes, it's true that dopamine is made through a synthetic process that begins with tyrosine. You can actually start it with phenylalanine as well. Similarly, we've talked about in the past, serotonin and melatonin have their amino acid that they're derived from is tryptophan. So again, a lot of these monoamines and other chemicals that we use in our brains and our bodies do come from amino acids. Not that they're proteins themselves, but they're actually derived from the components of proteins, which are amino acids.
Yeah, exactly right. So why don't we talk a little bit about dopamine in itself, where we tend to experience a rush of dopamine in our daily lives right now, because it's so important for us to understand how intrinsically linked it is to a lot of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and in fact, it's become a target for a lot of companies in their marketing, how they promote their products to people. So for example, social media companies are notorious for the fact that they utilize dopamine science, the understanding of the psychology and the physiology of dopamine release to make you addicted to scrolling through your Instagram feeds or your TikTok reels. All of that is driven by really a lot of engineering focused on how best to get you to release more dopamine. Now, unfortunately, we don't have an infinite supply of dopamine in our brains. So things like social media, things like video games, things like having 1,000 channels of television to watch. There's so many rewards that are available today in modern society for us to fixate on that it becomes sort of a question of how are we going to reserve or preserve the dopamine that we need to do the really fundamental things in our lives, like take care of our kids, take care of our health, take care of our homes, go to work, be enthusiastic at work. How do we maintain and preserve our ability to release the necessary amount of dopamine in order to be motivated and enthusiastic and get things done in those really important parts of our lives when we perceive that those rewards aren't necessarily always as exciting as, Call of Duty or getting on Instagram or Tinder or something like that. Those rewards, unfortunately, tend to be overwhelming to the system. Now, the flip side of it is you also have to worry about whether or not the reward that you're expecting is sufficient to motivate you and is doing it correctly. Because what can happen is you can have what's called mismatch. And mismatch happens when you expect a certain amount of reward. You expect a certain amount of reward from an action. I liken it to somebody hands you a box of chocolates and you really want the one that has caramel in it, okay? But you reach in and you grab one and you put it in your mouth and it's got coconut, okay? And some people like coconut. I'm not a big fan of coconut and chocolate, but I know it can be really tasty for some people. But for me, if I pick one up and I'm like, yuck, I don't want that. That is where there was a mismatch. I was expecting and hoping for a chocolate that I really liked, and I got one that I don't really like that much. Now, what could that do? That could reduce the number of times that I try chocolate. If that continues to happen every time, I'm just not going to take, maybe it's me only from that person or only from that box. But the flip side of it can be, okay, if I reach in and I grab the first one and it has caramel in it, well, my goodness, that's my box of chocolates. I'm not going anywhere without it because that's got everything I want in it. And it's all a function of how dopamine is being released and metered out in the brain. So you can imagine how you can sort of carry that forward from a box of chocolates into all of the other things that happen in your life. So you have to make certain that the reward that you expect is the reward that you get. And it goes, I'm just going to say one last thing about it because my wife is in human resources. And one of the things that we talk about around dopamine is what happens when a boss or the company you're working for doesn't live up to your expectations of what your pay is going to be or your advancement within the organization, that's where people start to get burned out. They lose enthusiasm for the job. They lose enthusiasm for their careers even because they're not seeing this reward balanced with the work effort that they're putting in. And that's really, I think, maybe the easiest way for people to understand how dopamine is really important. If you expect,
there's no question.
Go ahead.
I love that analogy, the chocolate analogy, and the anticipation of the caramel and then hitting the coconut and the mismatch occurring. And that analogy really resonates with me. It's very clear that the driver is this anticipation or this desire for a particular outcome, and the link is not necessarily there, but the drive to try to choose the right chocolate out of that box is initially a dopaminergic effect, right? And then the resultant occurrence is secondary, but it isn't dopamine that creates that reward feeling. We often mistake that as being the thing that we're looking for, that reward. And ultimately, the reward is a nice piece, but often that dopamine piece is integrated as the reward.
Exactly.
So let's. I just want to quickly mention, you mentioned the dopamine science that has gone into a lot of the apps, the social media that we all have on our phones and whatnot. And it all comes back to this book called Hooked by Nir Eyal, who wrote a phenomenal book on how to create kind of this hook or this desire for people to want to stay on a certain app or want to go on to a certain app. It's the ding that happens on your phone when you get a new notification, or the number of likes that you see on your Instagram image or whatnot. Those are drivers through a dopaminergic pattern to help you stay on that. You want to see how many people liked your post. You want to see who messaged you on this particular thing, right? That rush or that anticipation that comes from that. Nir Eyal then realized what he had done, and he created a book called Indistractable to help people not become as hooked to a lot of the apps that then were created on the back of his work. So really, really great books for those who are interested in looking into the dopamine science a little bit more in depth.
For sure. And that's the psychology side of things. And there's a physiological side to it too. We talked a little bit about where dopamine comes from, and we've talked about ways in which our behavior or our actions in life can deplete that. But there's also ways physiologically that dopamine production can be damaged. You hinted at that with nutrition. If you don't take in the essential amino acids necessary as the precursors for making dopamine, then you won't make it enough. But there are genetic issues around dopamine receptors. There's issues around inflammation. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, because that's always a cornerstone of problems and ailments in the body. But when you're sick, you don't feel motivated, and that's a perfect segue, I think, into when your body is producing lots of inflammatory cytokines because you're experiencing some illness or some injury. You lose motivation. You lose that feeling of, hey, there's a reward that I want to go get. And you lose the ability to summon that dopamine levels. And it's very similar to the conversation we've had before around depression and other things around serotonin production. Serotonin production is disrupted by inflammation in much the same way that dopamine synthesis is also disrupted by inflammation.
Yeah, this is where a lot of parallels are drawn between kind of serotonin and dopamine. They both have very similar patterns in how they're produced from a very specific amino acid. And the effects that they have are often linked in parallel, even though serotonin is more of the like mood molecule, where dopamine is the motivation molecule. That said, they're produced in a particular area of the brain, each one of them. So let's talk a little bit about where dopamine is produced, and we can get into kind of the effect that vagus nerve eventually does have in that particular pathway.
Yeah, sure. So probably the most famous area where dopamine is produced in the brain is called the substantia nigra. And if you know anybody in your family or friends who have Parkinson's disease, you're probably familiar with the fact that dopamine production in that area is damaged. In fact, the area itself is damaged in Parkinson's disease. And that leads to, obviously the symptoms of tremors and difficulty walking, some gait disturbance, that shuffling that you see. It can actually impact your ability to differentiate between reality and hallucinations. There's hallucinations associated with Parkinson's disease as well. Now, not all of those things that we just talked about are associated with dopamine, because there are disruptions of other neurotransmitters that sort of follow on that damage in the substantia nigra. But that's really where dopamine is produced largely in the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a patient with a diagnosis of Parkinson's. It happened about 13 years prior to coming to see me. And one of his first symptoms was actually anosmia. He had lost his sense of smell. We'll come back to his case in a little bit, because there's some really interesting things that we did with the vagus nerve stimulation that have had profound effects. But a major challenge that he experienced, in addition to the anosmia, was his tremor. His intention tremor and his fatigue were the two major challenges that he was working to overcome when he first kind of came in to see me. And we'll get into what we did and kind of what happened there. But Parkinson's is one of those conditions where the direct link is this substantia nigra, the dopaminergic production in that area particularly.
Yeah. And there's two things to talk about there. One is that an early sign of Parkinson's, sort of almost like a prodromal symptom, if you will, of ultimately having Parkinson's disease, is a disturbance in sleep. Mm-hmm. And so what you see, it's actually almost, it's sad actually. What you see is these people come in with their spouses, and what you'll see is that the spouse has been hit during the night, not intentionally, but the reason for it is because when you begin to lose that dopaminergic signaling, one of the things that dopamine is responsible for is that sleep paralysis that you experience during the phase of sleep where you're not creating the dream, but now you're living the dream. So during that period where your body is experiencing it, in order to prevent you from running away from a lion or jumping out of an airplane or things like that, is to have your body paralyzed. So you're experiencing it, but your body is not able to move. When you lose that ability to induce that sleep paralysis because of a dopaminergic problem, you flail around in bed. You flail around, and as a result, if there's somebody sleeping in the same bed with you, they can be hit. But that appears to be about 5 years. When that begins, that's about 5 years before the onset of Parkinson's disease. So that's the first, thing to share. So if there's anybody out there who is experiencing that, or if you know somebody whose spouse is doing that, or they are, that's a sign that Parkinson's disease is very likely to progress in the future. And it's something that should be addressed quickly. So most people don't make that connection, but if you understand that can be helpful in delaying the progression of the disease. And one of the things that they give people once they are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease is a drug called l-dopa or levodopa. Leva meaning it's a chiral molecule, and as a result, even though the atoms are the same in the molecule, they're positioned differently in a way that makes one right-handed and one left-handed. The left-handed version, levodopa, is a precursor to dopamine. It's sort of on that cascade that we talked about that starts with tyrosine, goes through phenylalanine. So you've got this L-dopa that can be taken orally. It's a medication that you can take, and you can supplement the amount of dopamine you have in your body. So again, it's one of the various different ways to combat the disease. It's usually the go-to medication. It's very, seems to be very safe and fairly effective.
This is where inflammation really does come in to tell us that we might be going down this particular path, and inflammation, or uncontrolled inflammation in particular, could be at the root of it in particular, and the progression of that Parkinson's disease in particular. We have microglia present in every area of our nervous system. Those microglia were given the name glia because they were thought to be glue, but in fact, they are the immune system cell and the main driver of the state of the brain. So telling us whether we should be in more of a breakdown or more of a build-up type of perspective, and are we being careful to avoid any threats to the survival or the function of that particular organ. And microglia, we've talked about this many, many times on the podcast, when they become shifted into that inflammatory state and they're there for a long time, cause a breakdown in the neurons that are actually producing, in this particular case, in the substantia nigra, producing dopamine. When they are producing that dopamine and we go into that inflammatory state, the microglia can actually literally chew up, eat up those particular cells or the neurons that are producing them, and shut down or decrease the amount of production of dopamine that is occurring, which leads to the progression of this disease over time. So it is an inflammatory process that we have to be very, very conscious of that will drive this particular condition.
Yeah, and for those listeners who haven't been with us through many discussions about microglia, I think it's worth maybe spending 2 minutes just talking a little bit about microglia are the innate immune cells, the tissue-resident macrophages of the central nervous system, and they play an incredibly important role. They were present literally during gestation. They help to form the brain and all of the vasculature and the connectivity and the support cells. They are above all of the other cells. They are the ones that are responsible for having literally built your brain. And then they remain in place to, as you said, support and maintain the brain functioning properly. Each time they are shifted out of that support role, which is typically referred to as sort of a quiescent state, even though that's not really true because they're doing a lot of things. There's a lot of activity involved. And they are shifted into a pro-inflammatory state, you're slowly degrading their ability to function properly. Now, there's a lot of complexity associated how that slow degradation of their integrity happens. It involves everything from mitochondrial dysfunction to epigenetic drift to just a change in the proteostasis inside the cell. So as all of that shifts, what you see is these microglial cells are no longer able to put themselves into the right activity state, and they begin to do things maybe aberrantly. And one of the aberrant things that you just mentioned is chewing away at the connections or chewing away at the cells or giving the wrong signals to cells, the neurons. And as a result, it can degrade areas of the brain. We see it, for example, in Alzheimer's. We see that in the locus ceruleus, which is the area where norepinephrine is produced. In Parkinson's, you see it in the substantia nigra. And because it's a lifetime of insults and a lifetime of challenges and maybe genetic predisposition, but even more importantly, epigenetic effects that occur, that's why you tend to see it in older people. Yes, it is possible to have Parkinson's disease as in early onset, much the same way there's early onset Alzheimer's disease. But by and large, these neurodegenerative conditions are present in the elderly with a higher propensity for experiencing those symptoms as you get older.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certain things that will drive this condition to occur more quickly, and a lot of them have inflammatory roots to them. Things along the lines of, like Muhammad Ali, for example, is a great case of this, but multiple physical traumatic incidences in the head will increase the risk of inflammatory activity within all areas of the brain overall, but certain conditions are slightly more prone. And then early onset, Michael J. Fox is a great example of that exact type of situation where he's nowhere near his 50s and 60s by the point that he's been diagnosed and been suffering for years. So these things can happen with different triggers, different inflammatory or some can be biochemical or physical triggers that can cause the microglia to go into that inflammatory state. And if it's affecting specifically those microglia in the substantia nigra area, we're more likely to go towards that Parkinson's reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true really of all of the various different neurodegenerative conditions. The more inflammatory insults that you've experienced in your life, and at the risk of upsetting the billionaire boys club that's called the NFL, listen, there's a lot of football players who are experiencing these early onset, and it's not a result of genetics. Obviously, these are gifted genetically. People are gifted genetically, but they are physiologically advanced in age. And in fact, this is a great. I know we're going to spend a lot of time this season talking about aging, but I just want to spend another minute talking about why it is that we see this in the elderly more than we see it in middle-aged or youth. But yet we do see it in the middle-aged people who have experienced things that are a lifetime's worth of damage in a shorter period of time. And I think we can look at NFL players. We can look at people who are in the military. A lot of that very high explosive, high powered ordnance that's being shot and that they're around, there is a lifetime's worth of jostling of the brain, activating of those microglial cells that's occurring in a relatively short period of time. And, it's something that I think the military is becoming more and more aware of, is the fact that the environment that they're putting our soldiers into can be damaging over a long period of time where there's no visible signs of injury, but yet there's consequences, and the VA is dealing with it. And I think there's ways, and we're going to talk about ways in which we can minimize those insults, because ultimately it boils down to how inflamed are those cells, how much has their cellular metabolism been disrupted, and that's all about the autonomic nervous system and how we can regulate the immune system and cellular metabolism through the autonomic nervous system.
I don't think there's any coincidence as to why there's such a high proponent of NFL players, wrestlers, servicemen in the military, and first responders, firefighters that have significantly higher rates of nearly every neuropsychiatric condition that you could ever imagine. Everything from CTE to Parkinson's to Alzheimer's to dementia to PTSD. All of these conditions have a link to microglial hyperactivation for a long time and are directly linked to the trauma that they are experiencing in some way. And so there might be ways for us to actually create a positive shift in this and to actually send new signals to those microglial cells to not have that breakdown effect. And this is where vagus nerve really comes in. Why don't we talk a little bit about how the vagus nerve is connected to the substantia nigra and its effect on increasing dopamine production?
Sure. So the vagus nerve is the largest of the cranial nerves. It extends from the brainstem down into the body, although given the fact that 80% of the fibers are actually bringing information back up into the brain, it's probably better to say that it connects the body up into the brain. It's bringing information. It's the primary sensory organ that your brain uses to sense the state of affairs of your organs in your body. I mean, we've got the spinal cord bringing information up about muscles and how your motor systems are working. But in terms of just how your biochemistry in your body is working, that's really, that runs along that superhighway called the vagus nerve. When that information comes into the brainstem, it goes through an area called the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is in the very base of your brain. And that's where it starts to interact with areas, small areas called the little nuclei, like the locus ceruleus. I mean, your brain's got 86 billion neurons. Only a couple 100,000 of them, if even that many, are in the locus ceruleus. And yet that's the primary source of norepinephrine. So that's one of the first stops of the vagal signaling. There's other stops along the way, like the raphe nucleus, which is where the dorsal raphe nucleus is where serotonin is produced. The substantia nigra and dopamine is another area that's influenced by the release of norepinephrine. So norepinephrine plays a big role in sort of activating these other areas. One of the areas that's very important, and it goes to the entire control that the autonomic nervous system has over inflammation, is called the nucleus bacillus of Maynard's. And that's the area of the brain that's responsible for producing acetylcholine. And as we'll get into, that regulation of the immune system, that regulation of microglial cells, comes through that release of acetylcholine. So the practical upshot is if you activate the vagus nerve, and you can do that through a variety of different ways. You can do it simply by relaxing and taking deep breaths and spending some time meditating. But you can also activate it electrically or non-invasively or invasively with electrical stimulation directly onto the nerve. When you do that, you are causing the changes in neurotransmitter expression. And again, I think really importantly, it's that release of acetylcholine. And we'll dig into a little bit about why that's the case.
Absolutely. There have been a lot of studies to show that when vagus nerve is not working really well, we do tend to have a reduction in the amount of dopamine that can be produced in the midbrain and the substantia nigra. Why don't we dig in a little bit into that?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, when you're sick or you've got inflammation or you've been injured in some way, or toxins, you've encountered toxins that raise the level of inflammation in your body, raise the level of activation of the release of signaling proteins called cytokines and signaling molecules, I should say, called cytokines that are flowing through your body, indicating to other cells that they should become inflamed or pro-inflammatory as well. Those signals are carried by the vagus nerve up into the brainstem. And that's one way in which peripheral, your body's inflammation, can actually change the inflammation state of your brain. Even though the brain hasn't been injured and it's sitting behind that sort of Chinese firewall of the blood-brain barrier, there are ways that just nerve signaling can bring information back up into the brain that causes the brain to become inflamed. And so when that inflammation happens, there are biochemical pathways we talked about that take from those amino acids like phenylalanine and tyrosine and convert through enzymatic reactions into dopamine. Along the way, those reactions can be slowed or impaired or diverted, and so that you don't end up producing the dopamine that you need or that you want to have or need to have in order to be as motivated and as enthusiastic and as sort of on top of your game as you want to be. So it makes sense. When you're sick, you end up in that state. Now, there's other ways that you can change how that inflammatory state is in your body that don't necessarily involve getting a bacterial infection or a viral infection or getting injured. It can happen simply by being perpetually in a state of what we refer to as sympathetic overdrive. Think about it as fight or flight mode. If you're constantly in a state of overexcitation and you don't allow yourself on a regular basis to get back into a rest, digest, restore mode, things like being around family and friends, getting a good meal, sleeping, exercising, all of these things allow you to get yourself out of that sort of terror state of your immune system. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up with lots of extra inflammation. And that extra inflammation can then lead inside your central nervous system to a depletion of dopamine and actually a destruction of the areas that are producing dopamine, like the substantia nigra. I'll say one last thing because I'm always interested in how the metabolism plays a role in this. If you are significantly overweight, that is one of the very strongest ways that you can create a long-term systemic state of inflammation. And there is a correlation between obesity in middle age and Parkinson's disease in older age. It's not quite so extreme as what we've seen with Alzheimer's disease, but there are people who are referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. And I suspect that in the long run, we're going to find out that type 3 diabetes is all neurodegenerative disorders. It includes both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and some of the other neurodegenerative conditions that are equally devastating.
I'm going to have to concur entirely on that. Just to kind of piggyback on that idea, Where vagus nerve is involved is on the inflammatory control side of things, but also when we're in that sympathetic state, in like a chronic sympathetic state, the way that I explain this to my patients is like we're constantly pushing on the accelerator. Our foot is heavy on the accelerator. We're constantly in a go mode. And the problem that occurs when we're in a go mode is we can't restore, we can't fix a car when it's running, right? We need to be able to push the brakes. If, let's say, for example, you've got an issue, you take your car to the mechanic can't fix the car while it's still running. The car needs to come to a stop in order for the mechanic to be able to pop the hood and get underneath and do whatever they need to do. We can't restore, we can't recover, we can't fix any damage that's been done when the car continues to run. So the brakes are a necessary piece. And the brakes in this analogy are basically the vagus nerve. When the vagus nerve is turned on, when it's functional, when it's efficient, we're able to slow the car down and come to that recovery state more readily. And that's where we can heal on a regular basis. In an ideal situation, that healing state is instigated most of the day and very easily at night. But a lot of people are not sleeping well. A lot of people are under a ton of stress on a day-to-day basis. We're exposing ourselves to tons of chemicals that are pushing us into that sympathetic state more readily. Our diets are heavily inflammatory by nature in a standard American diet, for example. And what that does is it continues to drive more and more weight onto that accelerator, and the brakes, as they continue to try to slow the car down, eventually get worn out. And so we become less efficient, less strong in being able to put the car into its healing vagus nerve activated state. And that's really important to understand. And what we then need to do is rebuild the ability to control that inflammation. We need to rebuild those brakes. We need to replace the brake pads, ensure that there's enough fluid in the brake line, make sure there's no cuts in the brake line, ensure that the rotors are working well. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. But once that system is working well again, then we can start to slow down, get into that state more readily, and control all of those inflammatory processes so the car is not going off and being a danger to society. So that's really where on an individual basis, we need to understand that a lot of these stressors are major drivers of the inability to then control inflammation over time.
Yeah, and just to riff off what you're saying there, I think there's really two very important pieces that vagus nerve stimulation and the autonomic nervous system exert. The first is, and it really is probably the most important part, is that release of acetylcholine. When I mentioned before that activation of the nucleus bacillus of Maynard's, that release of acetylcholine causes, it's not just at individual synapses. It literally is released throughout the brain to raise the level of acetylcholine. And acetylcholine does several things. And the most important for our conversation right now is that when it binds to there's a receptor that sits on the surfaces of these tissue-resident macrophages of the brain, the microglial cells. And when that acetylcholine binds to that receptor, it changes how that receptor is shaped. It opens it up. It's what's called an ionotropic calcium channel. So calcium is moves between the outside and the inside of the cell. That does several things. But the most important, and there are really several different pathways that all do the same thing, there's sort of a redundancy. And when Mother Nature makes things redundant, that usually means it's pretty important. What it does is it downregulates inflammation. It tells the cell, hey, it literally flips a switch and the cell moves. And when I say flip a switch, I mean it's very fast. It happens within minutes. That cell changes how it's functioning and shifts back into that neurotrophic, supportive maintenance mode, doing the housekeeping tasks it's supposed to be doing, as opposed to being really rather destructive. And that's very, very important to downregulate the inflammation. But there's another piece of this which is very fascinating, and it really has such broad implications. It literally reaches even into cancer therapy, is understanding that when those immune cells are in an inflamed state, they change how they produce energy. So if you can remember back to your biology classes, I know that's not necessarily the most favorite thing for people to do, but you'll remember that the cell needs energy, that the cell is doing lots and lots of different biochemical reactions most of which are not favorable. And in order to get those reactions to work, they need to like plug in little battery packs, if you will, into that reaction that will push it in the direction that the cell needs it, even though it wouldn't otherwise go there. It's like trying to go uphill. And the molecule that the cell uses as sort of like a universal battery pack, if you will, is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so what happens is this little molecule comes along and it's got these 3 phosphates on it. And when there's a release of one of those phosphates, that's giving energy up. It's giving energy to something else where you add the phosphate to it. Kinases and other things do that. And so that little battery pack is moved from the ATP to something else, and the ATP becomes ADP. Now, that's adenosine diphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate needs to be converted back into ATP, sort of like recharging your battery. And that happens in a couple of different ways inside the cell. The simplest, most primitive way for that to happen is through a reaction called glycolysis. And glycolysis involves literally splitting a sugar. That's what, gly meaning a sugar and lysis meaning split. So it basically splits the sugar into 2 pieces called pyruvates. And when it does that, there's a release of, I think, 2 ATP per pyruvate. But that's leftover garbage. We think of it, we actually experience it when we go running and you build up lactic acid in your muscles. That lactic acid that's built up is really that pyruvate waste material. The much more efficient way for us to make energy happens in little organelles, which are actually little symbiotic animals, if you will, that live inside our cells, called mitochondria. If you remember from the movie, the Star Wars movies, remember the midichlorians that the Jedi had? They had these midichlorians that released the Force. Well, that was their way of merging mitochondria with chloroplasts. Chloroplasts do a very similar thing. They create energy inside plants, but all cells, plants and animals, have mitochondria in them to generate the ATP. What happens is that lactic acid, or in the case of fatty acids, because it's really important to use fatty acids also, it's a great use of fat. So we burn that or use it up inside our mitochondria to make lots and lots of ATP. It's like nearly 20 times more efficient. You make 20 times more ATP from the same sugar molecule using ATP, using a ATP synthase in mitochondria. But here's the problem. Here's the big problem. When you have inflammation and these cells become inflamed, they shift out of using the mitochondria to produce energy and they start relying on glycolysis. It's a process that is damaging and toxic to the cells. It can for short periods of time, it's okay. But over a long period of time, it's damaging. And one of the things that vagus nerve stimulation does by shifting the cell out of that inflamed state is it's restoring the cell's ability to use those mitochondria to generate energy. So one of the things that we see a lot, and I'm going to bring this back around to dopamine, one of the things that you see in a healthy person, that enthusiasm, that motivation, that drive that they have, is a function of the fact that not only are they generating enough dopamine and they haven't used it up using social media and other things that can sap it, but they also have functioning mitochondria that are generating the energy necessary to actually live up to their motivation. So we don't necessarily see the motivation, but we see the consequences of that in a person's behavior and a person's actions. So if you sort of link it all together, if you're healthy and low inflammation, you're going to be creating the dopamine, and you're also going to have your mitochondria functioning to give you the energy. And as a result, you'll be functioning properly, and you'll have enthusiasm and excitement and drive. What happens when you're inflamed is both systems get broken down, both the production of dopamine, so you don't have the motivation you need, but you also don't have the energy. So when people talk about the fact that they're burned out, one of the things that you see isn't just a lack of motivation on their part. You see a lack of movement.
Yeah.
They're fatigued. And fatigue is a big, partner, fellow traveler with loss of motivation is fatigue. So again, these systems all function in harmony with one another, whether they're for good or for bad. And so you see dopamine production and low inflammation and high energy production in the mitochondria all working along one axis. That's the good axis. And then the bad axis, if you will, the sort of the wicked witch, the west and the east, that is all a function of inflammation, screwing up your metabolism, screwing up the cellular metabolism, and disrupting dopamine production, along with serotonin production and other things. So you see all of those things run together: depression, burnout, lack of motivation, fatigue. They all come together.
The more we learn about it, the more we realize vagus nerve has such an important role in ensuring just optimal function of every single area of the body, from intracellular all the way to just inflammatory control. And I want to come down a little bit back towards this idea that we say the vagus nerve, but in reality, we have two major trunks of vagus nerve, one on the right side, one on the left side. Thus, we have the vagus nerves. And there actually is a difference between the two sides, and they do play an important role. And there is a very interesting study that you found recently that shows us that there is a strong distinguishing factor between the right side, and the left side. And specifically with what it has to do with dopamine. I'd be really interested to talk about this because we know that there's a size difference between the right side versus the left sides in terms of number of fibers that are in there. The connectivity is slightly different between the left and the right side, and the effect that it has up in the brain are slightly different as well. Why don't we dig a little bit into that?
Yeah, and this is, I don't want to say this is established science. This is still a bit controversial because there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this wouldn't be expected. Now, the vagus nerve does have two branches. One follows the carotid artery down on the right side, and one follows it on the left side. So it's very important. Sits inside that same sheath that contains the carotid artery and the jugular vein. It's right there. And on the left side, it innervates, much of your body. The right side innervates much of your body, but it also includes more of the heart and the lungs. So for many years, people sort of avoided the right side. They wanted to go on the left side. But I think there's evidence now that's coming out that there's far more fibers on the right side. There's about 200,000 fibers on the right side and only about 120,000 fibers on the left side. Again, you said there's two vagus nerves. Arguably, there's 300 plus thousand vagal nerve fibers. I mean, they innervate everywhere throughout your body, at least in your chest and abdomen. So it does appear, and I'll give you both sides of the story. A lot of the work done looking at fMRI work and connectivity work, anatomical work, would suggest that when the vagus nerves, plural, when information comes in, those fibers, those 320,000 fibers, begin to activate those nuclei in the base of the brain. And when it does that the effects are bilateral, meaning that fibers on the left are activating things on the right, and fibers on the right are activating things on the left, and that you only have to stimulate one side to get equal benefit. That you can double it if you do it on both sides, but one side is usually typically enough. This is one of the first studies that I've seen that suggests that there is some residual laterality, if you will, preference for one side over the other. And it has to do with the ability to increase dopamine release and preserve dopamine function or enhance dopamine function with the right side versus the left. Now, it may simply be a function of the fact that there are more fibers on the right versus the left, but it remains to be seen whether or not that the effects go beyond simply the number of fibers.
Yeah, for those who are listening, we've got the research study posted here on video. So if you're watching on video, you'll see this. It's a study that came out in 2021 in Frontiers of Neuroscience called Self-Administration of Right Vagus Nerve Stimulation Activates Midbrain Dopaminergic Nuclei. Really interesting study. And essentially, they were talking about this idea of lateralization, that each side may have a slightly different effect on the body. And they did basically a rat study where they checked to see if there was a difference between those that had left-sided versus right-sided implanted vagus nerve stimulators in the rats. And what came of it very clearly was a strong lateralization. And it stated very clearly that vagus nerve stimulation targeted to the right side rather than the left cervical nerve, preferentially activates the midbrain dopaminergic system. This was a really, really interesting study. I'd love for you to kind of give us a breakdown of it.
Yeah, and remember, the challenge with studies in rodents and saying that somehow tells us something about how vagus nerve stimulation affects humans is, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So, I don't think any listener thinks that the rat brain is the same as a human brain. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is that oftentimes studies are done in single genetic strain mice. And it just may be that these mice have a failure of connectivity that a wild type or a normal, and bring it up to our species, that we don't have. So again, I want to caution that all of the research that I've seen prior to this and been involved with, including in humans, doing fMRI studies of various different ways of stimulating the vagus nerve, have almost uniformly shown that the same thing happens on one side or the other. That said, this is an important finding because whether or not this is true, this laterality is true of serotonin production, it may not be. It may not be true of norepinephrine production. May not even be true of acetylcholine release. Probably isn't. But if you're going to use vagus nerve stimulation to treat patients with Parkinson's disease, or even better, if you can find people and if people can be identified during that 5-year prodromal phase where they're losing the ability to enter into that sleep paralysis mode. So now you sort of have a looking glass into the future. This is a person who is going to have Parkinson's and is currently right now having a problem in the substantia nigra. That's a great time to intervene with some vagus nerve activation, either exercises or use of a device to treat them. And it may very well be that stimulation on the right side versus the left is what you need to do. Given the fact that one side versus the other hasn't, to this date, been seen to be preferential, then it seems to me that this only suggests that you should try it on the right side first. Try it on the right side first, see if it works, and if it does, then know that your chances are you've got it. Or if you've been doing it on the left for some reason and you're not getting the benefits that you're looking for with Parkinson's disease, switch to the right.
That's exactly right. I would very much, in a clinical sense, caution against the simple use of just putting it on the right side and saying this is going to make a difference. We don't know for sure yet. Individual variances are really important to keep in mind here. That said, I'd love to end with that story of my patient who came in with Parkinson's diagnosis. And we started doing some vagus nerve exercises, deep breathing, humming, chanting, gargling, all the things that we talk about and that are kind of the ancient wisdom tools. And we had mild improvement, but nothing really major from a fatigue or a tremor perspective. Then he started stimulating, and he started using a device, particularly well-known device, and that device really was a major shift for him. So it was about 10 days into him starting to use it, and he was using it twice a day for 2 minutes, and 2 minutes each time. And he messaged me. He said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Okay." So I jumped on call with him, and he said, "I haven't been able to smell anything in about 13 years. And this morning I woke up and I could smell my wife cooking bacon downstairs." for the first time ever, which for me was obviously like, what a crazy win. I have goosebumps right now telling this story. At this point, he's been using device for a little over 8 months, and he's smelling things about 60 to 70% of the time. And his fatigue has significantly decreased. He is 73, I believe 74 now. And his fatigue has significantly decreased to the point where he is a star pickleball player in his league in Michigan. And his tremor is significantly reduced to the point where his mood, his motivation, just his overall happiness for his life have incredibly improved. So I really just wanted to share this story with you all. It is a story I feature.
I'd like to share a story actually of one of my very closest friends, who actually has worked with me now for nearly 20 years. He's 20 years older than I am, and he, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, started having symptoms of some form of neurological disorder. He wasn't sure what it was. It took him a while to get the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, and Parkinson's disease was what his mother had passed from. So he was pretty devastated to see that. But one of the things that he went on l-dopa, and that seemed to resolve a lot of his symptoms. And he is now a star pickleball player as well. I don't know if Parkinson's makes you a great pickleball player. It was very interesting that a lot of the symptoms, the slowness, that once he got into the game, he was virtually asymptomatic.
Yeah.
But once the game ended, he would then, it was almost like somebody flipped a switch. But the interesting thing for him was that he, and still even on l-dopa, still does in the morning when he wakes up, because the l-dopa is, there's a half-life of the l-dopa in your bloodstream. And by the time you have gone through the night and you wake up, there's not enough to really have a therapeutic benefit. And it takes about 25 to 30 minutes for the l-dopa that you take first thing in the morning to kick in. So there's a period of about a half hour where you're experiencing some of the symptoms. One of the symptoms that he was, sort of found almost intellectually interesting was that there was a tree outside his bedroom. And in the morning, when he would wake up and look outside at the tree, he would have effectively a hallucination. And the hallucination was two things. One, it was that he almost instantly would see faces in the tree. Much the same way when you're sitting outside and looking up at the sky and looking at clouds, you can see faces in the clouds. That's an interesting aspect of hallucinations. But the one that was very constant for him was that the leaves always appeared to be shaking. They appeared like it was windy out. And so he could see that the leaves were shaking on the trees. Not a strong breeze where the tree was bent over, but just the leaves were rustling. But there was no wind outside. And so he was hallucinating this movement of the leaves. And he's a scientist, so he was testing it on himself. The l-dopa, it would take about 25 minutes before the l-dopa, which has only really one effect, it's increasing dopamine production, where that would subside and the leaves would stop moving for him, because they weren't moving before either. What he said was that when he used a vagus nerve stimulator, that the effect was gone within a matter of a couple of minutes.
Wow.
So the effect, we talked about how quickly it affects the microglial cells. It actually affects the dopamine production that quickly also. So within just a matter of a couple of minutes, he said that would be sufficient to get the leaves to stop moving, and it was normal for him. So just not quite as amazing as smelling bacon, but still interesting.
Absolutely.
Still an interesting bit of interesting data. And listen, there's plenty of work, true clinical science work, not just the anecdotes we're talking about, that's ongoing right now and has, in some cases, been completed, demonstrating the effectiveness of vagus nerve stimulation in Parkinson's. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take l-dopa. Doesn't mean that other medications won't work, but it's a great adjunctive therapy to add on and will help manage some of the other symptoms, even if the main symptoms are being dealt with the L-dopa.
I love it. What a great way to end it for today with a couple of amazing stories. Quickly want to share that we've got The new book's coming out, so Upgrade Your Vagus Nerve is ready to go. And by the time you hear this, it should be out already. JP's got Vagus Immune Connection coming up very soon as well. So we have a couple of books for those who are really interested in digging into this topic over the next couple of months. So really excited to share that with all of you. And
congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It's a great read. Lots of information. It's a great follow-up to your original Activate Your Vagus Nerve book. And I hope that everybody who bought the first one buys this one, and everybody who's hearing this buys both of them. And I'm looking forward to mine coming out. Mine's a little more technical and a little more sciencey. So for those of you who like to dive into the biochemical pathways and understand some of the really deep science, the Vagus Immune Connection is a book for you.
I love it. Thank you so much. For those who got to this point in the podcast, please feel free to share this with one person that you think could benefit from this information. And we wish you all upgraded health. We'll catch you on the next one.